Today I'm going to be talking about, well, not hacking, but consulting. So, in my experience, my personal experience, I've talked to clients, I've worked at many consultancies, I've talked to a bunch of people here at the conference and beforehand and stuff, and pretty much this is their take, my take, and a lot of clients' take on what is commonly perceived as a vulnerability assessment, pen testing, and all those kind of things like that, which I'll get to in a second. So, a little bit about me. I'm a managing consultant with Alcorn Group. I've worked here in both, or here and abroad and interstate and all those kind of things as penetration testing, network engineering, all those kind of things there. So, enough about me. So, there's a lot of words that fly around typically when a vendor or when a client engages a vendor for performing pen testing. So they might float around something like vulnerability assessment, internal, external infrastructure, wireless, web app, social engineering, phishing, network architecture review, which is not technically pen testing, but all these words might float around and it can be quite confusing for a client. So hopefully after this talk and some of the questions that I might get a little bit later on, it might kind of bring everyone up to the same kind of level. So I'm going to take it as a perspective of I'm a client and what constitutes a typical engagement, what kind of things can you expect, what happens during these engagements, and what can you expect as a deliverable or during, pre, post, and all those kind of things. That's enough cats. No, there's no more cats in the presentation. So a typical engagement, there's a vulnerability assessment, there's a penetration test, there's a red team. So the penetration test is somewhat of a broad statement. It could be like a security assessment or penetration test or of something. So a vulnerability assessment, or VA as they're typically called, is an automated assessment of a web app, a source code, mobile app, internal, external infrastructure, or something. And typically what happens during this engagement, before I get to that, I'll give you some sort of insight into what most consultancies tend to go through and what most vendors tend to go through in terms of engaging a client. So typically you have the sales stuff, which is just like sales magic in my mind. You'll have a scoping scenario, so a consultancy or a vendor might, over the phone, in a meeting room on a whiteboard, basically say, hey, what do you have? What is it? Let me get intimate with it and understand the ins and outs. Typically you'll have a pre-consultancy check or something like a pre-engagement check or whatever they might call it, like pre-flight checks. And then you have the crux of the work is within the consultancy. Then you have some reporting, which is the best and most fun part of any pen test. And then you have something like a wash-up meeting, where typically a pen tester will come back in and say, okay, these are the things I found. Any questions or anything like that? The client goes ahead and remediates. This might take days, weeks, months, years. And typically there's a retest and a retest report component performed at the end to make sure that the things that have been remediated haven't introduced new vulnerabilities, and the things that have been remediated have been actually remediated, and there's no, I found cross-site scripting, yeah, because I blocked script alert, and say 1, and then say, well, script alert 2 is still working. So this thing can drag on a few times. In my personal experience, I've engaged previously with our previous employers and clients. I've gone through that iteration about 7 times. So what happens during this engagement? Typically a consultant is going to run a whole bunch of tools, scanning, web app, all those kind of things. And then as a very bare minimum, what you should expect as a client is a manual verification of those findings, which kind of leads into some of the things that I'll go into a little bit later on. And then after talking to some people at the con and previously, some consultancies go the next step and say, well, we would perform somewhat of a basic web application, because on any infrastructure you'll always see web apps, and certain consultancies will go that little step further, say, well, we kind of give you an indication of what low-hanging fruit is on any kind of internal web applications or external web applications. So VAs, there's some pros and cons to it. It's a very quick way to identify security issues within your organization, be it internal, external, on a certain apps or whatever. It really provides somewhat of a health check. It should be really seen as a health check. So a good example is something like you go to the GP and you'll say, hey, I'm just here for a checkup, and they'll kind of take your blood, do this, do that, say, yep, you're all good. Whereas if you go to a specialist and say, oh, my back is really sore, you won't typically go to a GP about that specific thing. You go to a specialist, and that's what is the difference between a vulnerability assessment and some of the other things I'll talk about. And generally, depending on the scope, obviously, can you perform a vulnerability assessment of the internet? It might take a little while, so that might obviously cost a lot of money, but generally, in my experience, it's a low-cost, very easy entry-level identification exercise for your organization. Some of the cons, it's a breadth versus depth kind of exercise. So when performing a vulnerability assessment, you just scan absolutely everything, and you do tend to follow your nose sometimes, and you might deep dive into certain aspects, which might be interesting, but generally, because it's low cost, it's tight time frames, and you don't have enough time to do everything. So there's no depth involved. There's no, we're going to identify every single web application vulnerability with all the users, admin user, all these kind of, I'm going to sign up for a free account and deep dive into it. So that's the kind of things you have to think about when you're performing a VA. And by any means, it definitely should not be considered a comprehensive security assessment of internal, external, or like whatever the in-scope items are. So as a client, when a vendor comes into your organization, what are the kind of typical questions they should be asking? And those questions might indicate the level of competency and their maturity as an organization that performs these kind of services. So things like in a VA, typical questions are what networks are in scope, how many IP addresses. If it's a big network, you say, well, we got 65,000 IP addresses. And like, well, that's going to take a long time. But how many of those ones do you expect to be live? Generally, a rule of thumb is about 20–30%, depending on the network, obviously. And are there any other kind of security controls in a way, such as like WAFs, firewalls, proxies? So in my experience, what you'll get is if you're testing through a WAF or a firewall, some poor security guys getting a lot of alerts because Nmaps or Nessus is running and their inbox is full of alerts saying, oh, hackers on your network. So those things typically need to be turned off from the scannings. And can scanning run 24/7? Right? There's only 8 hours typically in a consultancy day. Scanners take a long time to finish generally, and if you can run those things overnight, if you feel it's not going to impact your network, those are the kind of questions that you should be expecting for the consultancy. Save you a bunch of time. Instead of saying, oh, this will take 5 days, it might actually take about 2.5 because you halve the time, or it might take 2. And can we perform it with credentials? That's a really good question to ask, just because if you perform a vulnerability assessment against a Windows server, some of the tools have inbuilt kind of checks where it logs onto it and performs certain checks at the operating system level that will indicate more kind of low-hanging fruit. And has this been performed before? So a good indication of whether it's been performed before would hint at the organization's maturity, and also hint at the vendors looking to say, well, if you've done this before, it's a yearly exercise, yep, cool. What are the kind of things that has been identified in the past? You would have an understanding better than the vendor would, and you'll be able to provide them, say, yeah, okay, well, these services we know are vulnerable, we know these things, we're really looking to target that stuff, because last assessment, that stuff fell over. Can you make sure you target it slowly, but we want full coverage? And generally, these questions are asked by any consultancy just to get an indication of how long it'll take. It's not a deep dive into your intellectual property or anything. It's really just to provide them with the understanding of, okay, well, you have 65,000 IP addresses, 60,000 are live. That will take a very, very long time. So as a client, what should I expect from this kind of engagement? Well, first of all, you should expect a report. And second of all, within that report, you should expect to find the typical things: out-of-date software, network ports accessible, internal, external, all those kind of things that may hint at additional attack vectors you might use for next time, saying, well, we need a pen test because this one's got a lot of ports open. You'll see a lot of SSL cipher issues. There's not been one report that I've seen where this stuff doesn't take up the majority of it. And some low-level stuff, such as like HTTP headers and just really boring things. But sometimes the tools actually find things like default credentials, someone ran up a server just for testing purposes and they ran it with default credentials. The scanners typically pick it up, and it's really trying to identify the low-hanging fruit. And probably one of the most important things I would expect out of a vulnerability assessment report is no false positives. That kind of really indicates the fact that the vendor went through and actually manually verified every single one of those ports that were open and vulnerabilities that was identified. I've seen in the past where reports have kind of indicated, yeah, you have a critical vulnerability because the robots.txt file was accessible. So, penetration test. I'll let you read that, but it's basically a proactive attempt, an authorized attempt to test the exploitability of vulnerabilities in OS, application configurations, and any kind of risky behavior by end users. What it's not specifically is not a definitive assessment of your organization's security. So just because you get told, yep, you will get a pen test and you don't have to worry about anything else, it's not unfortunately like that. And it's not an assessment of your organization's resilience against 0 days. Those things are coming out every single day. New ones are being exploited, and it's a cyclic thing. And it's not a whiz-bang, insert cyber cloud kind of buzzword here sort of thing. So, penetration test, what can you expect? Different vendors will have varying methodologies, and that typically kind of encompasses these things where you perform some kind of reconnaissance, you do discovery, you enumerate services, you identify vulnerabilities, you exploit those vulnerabilities when they're safe. Typically, good communication is really, really key at this point. And analysis of the impact. I think analysis of impact is somewhat one of the most important things, just because what is the impact to your business? An external vendor coming in may not understand your business through and through. That I believe separates good from great consultancies. The fact that they've taken the time to understand, oh yeah, I know how Queensland Transport works, or I know how a banking system works, and what does that mean to a client? So there's, like anything, there's pros and cons to pen testing. It's a really good thorough assessment of a specific asset or group of assets at a certain time. Might be internal, external server builds, blah, blah, blah. And it highlights many issues, typically configuration, patching, and what I think is typically not found is business logic flaws and second stage kind of flaws as well, but specifically around business logic, where you can see that a consultancy has really kind of dived down into it. Yeah, so we do have business logic flaws that kind of come out in these things, and that kind of indicates that a pen tester has actually gone through and actually tried to understand what they're testing, instead of just blindly run that tool. Yes, I got SQL injection. Yes, I was able to enumerate the database. Bing, bang, boom, I'm done. Whereas some of the, yeah, anyway, I won't dwell on it. So some of the cons, it can be somewhat expensive compared to a vulnerability assessment, where it's the whole breadth versus depth. This is definitely on the depth side of things, and it can be sometimes disruptive. For instance, I wouldn't, test very sensitive networks or very sensitive assets, such as pacemakers. So, here we go. So what should be asked? So what, as a client, what should I be asked? In addition to VA questions, I would kind of be expected to ask, okay, do you have authority to perform the pen test? In my personal experience, it's sometimes in the 11th hour where you engage with the client and they'll say, oh yeah, this stuff's in AWS. And there's a series of things that have to go on for you to know, let AWS know to say, hey, we are performing a pen test, here's where we're doing it, here's the dates, here's what we're going to do, these are the tools that we're going to run, expect higher traffic loads than normal between these hours, and that kind of, AWS and really any shared provider, it kind of provides them an indication, because AWS do have really good controls in place to indicate if they're getting tested or if they're getting hacked or something like that. Although you may not pay for it, they might kind of give you, say, hey guys, I think you're getting hacked here. So an exact scope of the assessment, so kind of highlight any fragile portions of the network, things like SCADA, or any things that are out of scope specifically, like denial of service testing is typically out of scope, although we've been asked a few times saying, hey, can you DOS us, and we'll see what happens. And IPS IDS. Now, this is really somewhat of a question we get asked frequently. Why should I disable my IPS? You're a hacker, you can bypass it. Well, yeah, of course, but it'll take 6 months. And then you slap them with an order for $250,000, and they say, well, how come it costs this much? Well, turn that off, and we'll it'll come down to like 25 grand or something like that. So, and then also from which perspective? Do you want to do it from a user perspective, like simulated typical user, administrator, obviously elevated rights, or unauthenticated kind of 15-year-old kid on school holidays? And I think very importantly, you should ask them, do you have a methodology of the thing that you're actually testing that really indicates the maturity of the organization? So do you have a methodology for web application testing? Yes, we do. Okay, let's run through it. What kind of things do you do? What kind of what should I expect? And what are the checks that you look for? So as a client, again, what should I expect? Well, obviously a report, because that's what you're paying for. And definitely no false positives. If you see a lot of false positives in a pen testing report, it kind of indicates that they may have just blindly run tools and not actually interpreted any of the results there. A summary really indicating the high-level findings, and I really stress this point and what it means to your business. And again, I kind of really believe that kind of separates good and great consultancies. And findings. So stuff that can be ripped out of the report, said, hey, DevOps, or hey, sysadmin, we have this bug here. They say, all you have to do is run this command to replicate it, or dev, all you have to do is run this inside this command prompt or this comments field or something like that to replicate across that scripting. There you go. And then any kind of communications can be performed after that, which leads me to very clear communications throughout the engagement, and that includes pre-engagement, post-engagement, and during the engagement. When that report comes out, there should not be any surprises coming out of it. The last thing you want is you have a project, it's going for 3 months, you're in that tail end of, yep, we're doing pen testing in the last week, because that's when it always happens, just before go live. Go live's next week, it'll be fine, and then all of a sudden Friday afternoon comes, you get slapped with the report and it's got 20 critical vulnerabilities on it, and all of a sudden Monday is a really difficult conversation with a board to go live. So red team, I won't really kind of jump on it too much, because yeah, Ed kind of did a great talk about red teaming. Pipes is on next or soon, talk about red teaming as well, so I'll kind of get them to talk about some of the specifics. But I will like to kind of state that it's a controlled and simulated attack against an organization, and Pipes gave me a really good example. That's typical type of things that you might find in a web testing report is something like a user enumeration would be constantly considered as a low, right? In a red team, it's really gold, because you're going in without knowledge, without any kind of understanding of what goes on within an organization. All of a sudden, you can enumerate all their users, and then first name dot surname at email, start some phishing campaigns, and you're golden. So some of the pros and cons with red teams are really, it's a good indicator of the ease of compromise, not the likeliness, but the ease of specific assets. Now, red teams can be somewhat finite with their output. So you might be told, okay, target this specific thing in this specific data center with a specific kind of application running on it because there's your flag. And all of a sudden, you've gone in one way and you've missed all these other things because that's the way that you went. Every test is different. That's the way that you went. And that's the kind of path of least resistance. And all of a sudden, you've missed out the entire workstation base and user base because you could walk straight into the data center. So it should be a realistic impact of security vulnerabilities to your organization, not as a general, but specifically when targeting certain assets. So some of the cons is it really shouldn't be a comprehensive assessment of your entire IT. It's really the path of least resistance. Yeah. Are there any questions?